sp class. So now we can look at the structure activity relationship, and that is our general structure. That is our R. That is our R. Here now they are calling this position 1 and that position 4. So that is our free amino group, and that is our sulfonyl group. That is our sulfonyl group. That is our free amino group. And we did say if you put an R at that position, then your resultant drug will be a prodrug, because you do require free group should recite para to the sulfonamide group for activity. But we have looked at thorium sulfonamide and also the succinyl sulfonamide, and which do have groups at that position, but they are prodrugs. Then, of course, at this position, the sulfur atom should be directly linked to the benzene ring. So that link is direct, and this group and that group must be para to each other if this compound is to have activity. Again, we are going to look at this in details. We also, at this position, will vary the activity. The nature of the substituent here is very, very important, because the nature of the substituent here, one, will influence activity and also will influence toxicity of the resultant sulfonamide. When you have electron donating substituent, that is SO2, leads substituent 2 SO2 leads to increase in antibacterial activity. When we look at the groups that are substituted, one of the things we see is that normally you have heterocyclic rings, and they will have either nitrogen or oxygen or sulfur. Let us be reminded that nitrogen, oxygen, and sulfur have two characteristics. One, they are electronegative. Oxygen having the highest, I think, followed by nitrogen, followed by sulfur, even I'm not wrong, but I'll confirm that you have nitrogen followed by so this oxygen is the highest, I want to believe, followed by nitrogen, and then followed by sulfur. And when you have a compound which has high electronegativity compared to the atom it's joined to, when you have an atom like oxygen which has very high electronegativity, it will withdraw electrons through negative inductive effect. So we must always remember that oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen will withdraw electrons from carbon through negative inductive effect. But we must also be reminded that oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen also have lone pairs of electrons. So they will also push electrons to the sulfur through resonance. The importance of pushing electrons to sulfur through resonance is stabilization. So the electrons, where we are talking about electron rich, we are talking about electron rich atoms in terms of lone pairs of electrons which can be pushed to the sulfur and stabilize the sulfur through resonance. But it's also important for us to note that these atoms that are also attached to the nitrogen, which is attached to the sulfur, are also electronegative, and therefore they will pull electrons from nitrogen even as they donate electrons for resonance stabilization. So those atoms are doing two things. They are donating electrons for resonance stabilization, which we find is very important, but they are also pulling electrons from nitrogen, and in pulling it from nitrogen, then they are making the hydrogen that is attached to the nitrogen to have electron deficiency, because once you pull electrons from the nitrogen will pull electrons from the hydrogen will be electron deficient, and that hydrogen can be readily lost. And that is why these sulfonamides are ionized at physiological pH. Sulfonamides are ionized at physiological pH, and the ionization is as one, the atom that is attached on the heterocyclic ring is electron withdrawing. The sulfone group S double bond O is also electron withdrawing. Therefore, the electron withdrawing nature of the sulfone and the electron withdrawing nature of the atom that is found on the heterocyclic ring, which is attached to the nitrogen, when they pull electrons from the nitrogen, they leave the nitrogen as electron deficient, Nitrogen has high electronegativity, so it will therefore pull electrons from the hydrogen. The hydrogen will be left naked, easily lost, and therefore allowing for the ionization of sulfonamides at physiological pH. The other, because that's one property. The next property that will happen to the sulfonamides, when those sulfonamides now are ionized, when they are ionized, you do have lone pair of electrons of the oxygen, you do have lone pair of electrons of the nitrogen, you do have lone pairs of electrons of the sulfur, which are found on the heterocyclic ring that is joined to the nitrogen, which is joined to the sulfone group. So those heteroatoms within the cyclic ring, because of the presence of the lone pair of electrons, they can do stabilization through resonance, and therefore ion that has been formed can be stabilized through resonance. Remember, when you stabilize an ion through resonance, that means the charge is shared. The charge is shared through several atoms, and the sharing of that charge through several atoms stabilizes the ion. So we are saying the ion, the negatively charged ion formed by the sulfonamides, becomes stabilized by resonance because of the lone pair of electrons found on the heteroatoms within the cyclic groups, the heterocyclic rings that are attached to the nitrogen. And that stabilization of that anion makes that anion stable. And that is why the sulfonamides will exist as ionized at physiological pH. I hope that is clear. I have started with the sulfone group, the groups that are on the heterocyclic ring are electron withdrawing. So they will allow for the hydrogen to be naked. They will allow for the hydrogen to be deficient of electrons and therefore easily lost. So once it is lost, you are left back with a negatively charged ion. For that negatively charged ion to exist, it needs to be stable. And of course, for it to be stable, it is stabilized by the lone pair of electrons found on the atoms that are found on the heterocyclic ring, and therefore the sulfonamide can be ionized at physiological pH. It is thought for the activity of the sulfonamide, it requires to be ionized. Also, for reduced toxicity of the sulfonamide, it needs to be ionized because the ionized moiety is water soluble. And once the ionized molecule is water soluble, as it gets into the urine, as it gets into the nephrons, where you have a lot of the acidity, where you have the urine within the nephrons have a pH of 6. So as this drug gets into the urine where there is reduced pH, if you have reduced pH and this drug is poorly water soluble, it will be precipitated out in acidic pH. But when this drug is well ionized, even in the acidic pH, it will still remain in solution. For those drugs, for those sulfonamides that are poorly ionized, when they get into the urinary or in the urinary tubules or into the nephrons, because of their poor water solubility, because of their low ionization, they will be precipitated. And one of the major toxicities of some of those sulfonamides is what we call crystal urea. Crystal urea. Crystal urea comes about because of the sulfonamides that have low water solubility, low ionization, because the groups that are attached to them are not powerful electron withdrawers, are not also powerful stabilizers. So once you get low ionization of that sulfonamide, when it gets into the lower pH environment or the highly acidic environment of the tubules, because the urine is pH 6, the pH of the urine is not the same pH as the body. The pH of the urine is at pH 6. So when these sulfonamides get into the nephrons, where the urine, the fluid that is passing through the tubules, is at pH 6, if they have low water solubility, they will be precipitated through protonation. They just require to be protonated back, and they will be precipitated, and they will cause crystouria. So therefore, the substituents that are found, we call it, let us still call it position number 1 even now. The substituents, therefore, that are found on the sulfonyl group are very, very important, because they will determine whether the sulfonamide is going to be precipitated in when it passes through the urine, and if it is precipitated, it will cause crystouria, or whether it will remain in solution because the pKa of that drug is low enough to allow it to remain in solution. And once the pKa is low, that drug will remain in solution. It will be a strong acid compared to the acidity in the urine, remain in solution, and once it remains in solution, we will avoid crystouria, which is the main toxicity of the sulfonamides. I hope that is very clear, that substituent at position number 4, here we are calling it position number 1, but earlier we had called it position number 4. That substituent at that position, whether we call it 1 or 4, is very, very important, because it will use crystouria through allowing for ionization of the sulfonamide. So the major features of the SAR of sulfonamides include the following. The sulfonilamide cell skeleton is a minimum structure requirement for antibacterial activity. The sulfonilamide is an NH2, SA2NH2, and a benzene ring. That's the sulfonilamide. That is the basic structure you must have. The amino and sulfonyl groups on the benzene ring are essential and should be in position 1 and position 4. The N4 amino group could be modified to be prodrugs. So the 4 amino groups, so you're still using the same naming system. The N4 amino group could be modified to be prodrugs, which are converted to free amino function in vivo. Nothing new. The sulfur atom should be directly linked to the benzene ring, and we have said that. Replacement of the benzene ring by other ring systems or introduction of additional substituents will decrease or abolish antibacterial activity. So the benzene ring is necessary for activity. Further substitution apart from the 2 substitutions again will reduce activity. So I hope you can see we are building our case, starting from the sulfonilamide, important for activity. The para-amino group, important for activity. The sulfomoyl group, important for activity. And we have said, of course, if you substitute the 4 amino group, you will get prodrugs. You must increase your free amino group for activity. Any other substitution not acceptable. Any other substitution not activity as acceptable. The sulfur must be there, cannot be replaced with anything else. If you do so, you will abolish activity. Exchange of this sulfomoyl group by an amide reduces activity. So the sulfomoyl group is also important for optimal activity. On N1 substituted sulfonamides, activity varies with the nature of the substituent group, with substituents imparting electron-rich characters to the sulfomoid. Notice now the sulfone group, bacteriostatic activity increases. All we are saying here, this electron-rich this electron-rich character is what I've said, that the heteroatoms are putting on the heterocyclic ring have lone pairs of electrons, and because they have lone pairs of electrons, they can donate, they can stabilize the anion that is formed through resonance. They can stabilize the anion that is formed through resonance, but they are still electron withdrawers. They are withdrawing electrons, but they can stabilize the anion formed through resonance. So please differentiate that. Electron-rich character is where these heteroatoms have lone pairs. Sulfur has lone pairs of electrons, oxygen has lone pairs of electrons, nitrogen has lone pairs of electrons. So we are saying when you have heterocyclic ring, you will have better activity than when you have carboxylic rings, because the heteroatom will stabilize the anion that is formed through resonance. But you will still require those electron withdrawer atoms with high electronegativity to pull away electrons through inductive effect. These are two different processes. There is stabilization through resonance. There is pull of electrons through electron negative inductive effect, and therefore allowing for the formation of the anion. Heterocyclic substituent lead to highly potent derivatives, as we have said earlier. Sulfonamides, which contain a single benzene ring at N1 position, are considerably more toxic than heterocyclic ring analog. So if you have sulfonamides which contain a single benzene ring at the N1 position, are considerably more toxic than the heterocyclic. This toxicity is what I have talked about, crystalluria. When you have that benzene ring and just an amino group, those sulfonamides are more toxic. They will lead to crystalluria as compared to sulfonamide like sulfur methoxazole, sulfur thiazole, or sulfur diazide, which have a heterocyclic group attached to the amino group, to the sulfomoyl group. And once you attach that group, it stabilizes the anion formed, and therefore this sulfonamide is more water soluble. And because it's more water soluble, even when it gets to acidic media, it will be readily excreted without undergoing crystallization to precipitate crystalluria, which is a major toxicity of these sulfonamides. The free aromatic amino group should recite para to the sulfonamido group or the sulfomoyl group. Its replacement at ortho or meta position results in compounds which have no antibacterial activity. The active form of the sulfonamide is the ionized form. Active form of the sulfonamide is the ionized form. Maximum activity is observed at those pKa's. That is, of course, 6.6. And you can see it even at the pH, pKa of the body. 6.6 is around the pH of urine to 7.4, which is the pH of the body. So these drugs are ionized even at physiological pH, and you can see they will also be ionized and even pH of the urine. Substitutions in the benzene ring of the sulfonamide produces inactive compounds. So no other substitutions on the benzene ring. Substitution of free sulfomic acid. Sulfomic acid is where you have the S double bond O OH. That is the sulfomic acid. Group for sulfonamido group functions destroys activity. So you cannot replace the sulfomoyl group with a sulfonic acid group. That will destroy activity. But if you replace it, this is not sulfonic, this is sulfinic. So please correct this, sulfinic. This is an I. Replacement, because this would be the same as this. So this is replacement by a sulfinic acid. I here, sulfinic acid. And remember the 4 PHO in some of the books is replaced with an FO. Still is acceptable. So replacement by a sulfinic acid group, which is the SO2H. SO2 is S double bond O hydrogen. So S double bond O, S double bond OH. That is the sulfonic acid. S double bond OH. And acetylation of the N4 position retains back the activity. So we are saying we can't replace the sulfomoyl group with a sulfinic acid group, but not a sulfonic acid. If you replace the sulfonic acid, there is loss of activity, but you can't replace the sulfinic acid with retention of activity. We did also mention you can do acetylation again with retention of activity. Meta-substituted sulfonamides bind to the basic centers of the adenine, histidine, lysine site of proteins. Binding groups are alkyl, alkoxyl. This is now telling us about the substitution. If you look at most of the sulfonamides, they do have meta substitutions, either a methoxy group or a methyl group. So this is now explaining the need for the substitution. Like you can see sulfur dimethoxane, you're saying it has, you start from here, this is ortho meta. This is ortho meta. So this, you're considering, this is where this group, the heterocyclic ring is joining, so that is ortho meta. It's joining here also meta. So we are saying meta-substituted sulfonamides bind to the basic centers of the adenine, histidine, and lysine sites of proteins. The binding groups are either alkyl, alkoxy, and halides. Remember, when this drug binds, in other words, remember the site of action will have this amino acids, adenine, histidine, to have those amino acids. These amino acids we found at the receptor, whether outside the actual receptor, but they will be found around the receptor. When a drug binds firmly, it gives you better activity. So that's all we are saying, that therefore, when we do substitution at the meta position, either by a alkoxy group, alkyl groups, and you have seen quite a number of the drugs have a methyl group, or an alkoxy group. We have seen some of the drugs like the sulfur dimethoxide, and it's a dimethoxide because it has 2 methoxy group, and even halides. This will bind to the surrounding area and anchor the drug more firmly. And once you anchor the drug more firmly, then it will be able to bring about the biological activity. The binding affects the activity of the sulfonamide. Protein binding appears to modulate the availability of the drug and its half-life. So it will affect the binding of the drug at the site of action. And of course, also the protein binding will also have an influence on the availability of the drug and its half-life. So again, when we put these groups, they will also have an influence on the half-life. When you put methoxy group, when you put the alkyl groups, they will also interfere with the half-life, because this drug also will be more strongly bound to proteins. And once it's strongly bound to proteins, it will have a longer half-life. So its binding will affect the activity of the sulfonamides, and also the protein binding will also modulate the availability of the drug and its half-life. Remember, the only drug that can bring about pharmacological activity or biological activity is the free drug. So when they are doing their in vivo testing, what they do is that they continuously increase on the dosage, and the optimal dose, which now be used, will have catered for that drug that is always permanently bound to the proteins. It will cater for that drug that is permanently bound onto the proteins, and it will be permanently bound to the proteins during the time you are taking the drug. Because if you are taking the drug 2 times daily, you will exhaust what is in the plasma, you take more, and therefore you will have still some bound and some free. Of course, now when you finish taking the drug, that is why a bit of the drug will remain in the body, and if there is any toxicity, the toxicity will last a little bit long. And of course, the effects, sometimes the drug that is bound for some of the drugs, even when it is released after you stop taking the drug, does not meet the minimal inhibitory concentration, and therefore might not bring us activity. But in case of toxicity, then the toxicity of that drug will last for a long time. The lipid solubility influences the pharmacokinetic and antibacterial activity, and so increases the half-life and in vitro. In other words, the groups you are putting, if they increase, depending on the influence they have on the lipid solubility, if they have positive, if they increase lipid solubility, then again, there will be higher, there will be longer. There will be longer. Like if you put a methyl group, methoxy groups will have an oxygen. But when you put methyl groups, the methyl groups increase lipid solubility. So you'd expect that drug substituted with methyl groups will have longer duration of activity than a drug that does not have methyl groups. Again, when you have methyl groups, remember, the methyl groups will, of course, also add electrons into the system. The methyl groups will add electrons into the system. When they add electrons into the system, they will decrease the electronegativity of those atoms, and therefore they will increase the pKa of that drug. But that we'll see in a minute when we compare the different pKas, and I will visit that point again. You have a few minutes. I didn't want to go beyond time. So please let us note that there is specific structure-activity relationship of the sulfonamides. There are certain groups that must be retained. We have said if you have heterocyclic rings, the resultant sulfonamide has lesser toxicity. That sulfonamide has better activity because of the stabilization of stabilization of anion, and it is thought that it is the anion that indeed has activity. We have also said the substituents at meta position anchor the drug better at the site of action. They also are responsible for binding proteins, and therefore in binding proteins, they will also have an influence on the duration of activity of these drugs that we have already mentioned. Side effects and resistance to sulfonamides limit their use. The side effect, as we have said, the major side effect of sulfonamide is crystalluria, and that crystalluria can occur, especially if for any reason your urine has very high acidity. If your urine has very low pH, then the sulfonamides are weak acids, and therefore, because they are weak acids, if your urine has very high, very low pH, these sulfonamides, no matter how good their solubility is, they will be precipitated in the kidney urea. And occasionally, and that's why when you dispense sulfonamides, you normally advise the patient to take in a lot of fluids. A lot of fluids. It doesn't matter whether it is woody, whether it is water, whether it is soup, but make sure they hydrate themselves. They take enough fluids, because when they take enough fluids, then they will improve on the solubility of the sulfonamide, because of course the blood will have lower concentration, and therefore the sulfonamides can be more soluble. Also, for some of the patients, you find you can't do what you call alkalinization of the urine. You give them sodium bicarbonate, and the sodium bicarbonate will alkalinize. When the sodium bicarbonate is absorbed, as it gets into the urine, it will make the urine alkaline. And of course, sulfonamides, which are weak acids are more soluble in basic media, and therefore if you alkalinize the urine, alkalinization of the urine will also solve the problem of crystalluria. But we are saying the major drawback of the sulfonamides is their crystalluria, and in addition, resistance. And that resistance came in, as we have said, because they were considered to be wonder drugs, and they were misused, and therefore the microorganisms developed a lot of resistance. Penicillins, which we had earlier looked at, of course, have been used. Or while, because the penicillins were developed after the sulfonamide, of course, we are still having the same challenges of resistance towards the penicillins. And particularly sulfonamide denote three classes. So we can have again three classes of the sulfonamides, as we have discussed. You have the sulfonylamides. The sulfonylamides are the ones with a free amino group there, SO2NH, and they can have a substitution. Those are sulfonylamides, or their sulfonylamide derivative. Remember, sulfonylamide is the prototype, and there will be derivatives of sulfonylamide. Then you can have prodrugs giving active sulfonamides, and those are the prodrugs. And we discussed them when we were discussing the classification, whereby these ones are prodrugs. They do have this group on this side. This group on this side is what we must get rid of, because we must have the free amino group. This group on this side, we require it for increasing the ionization of the sulfonamide. Then we have the non-aniline sulfonamides, and then aniline sulfonamide is like what we discussed, the mafenide, and we did mention it has a methyl amino group, and therefore is miscellaneous, different from the other sulfonamides. All sulfonylamides are sulfonamides. All sulfonylamides are sulfonamides, but not all sulfonamides are sulfonylamides, because this is not a sulfonamide. But not all, this is not a sulfonylamide. So it's considered to be a sulfonamide, but it is not a sulfonylamide, because a sulfonylamide must have an amino group there and a sulfamyl group there. This has a sulfamyl group there, does not have an amino group there, and therefore we cannot call it a sulfonylamide, but it is considered to be a non-aniline sulfonamide. I hope that is clear. So those are the three categories of the sulfonamides, which we have also discussed when we were looking at the activity. I've mentioned that the sulfonamides are weak acids. So now what we want to demonstrate How that happens, so you have acidity of the sulfonamides. They are weak organic acid due to this sulfonyl group by loss of proton and stabilization of the negative charge by resonance, which I have explained. And this determines the pKa of the drug. So if you have this drug here, there is the aromatic ring. Of course, this aromatic ring is an aniline ring. This is the group which we are saying is undergoing ionization. So you lose a proton. If you this group here now will carry a negative charge, and there can be stabilization by resonance, this moving in, this moving out. And remember, stabilization by resonance means that the negative charge does not belong to one atom. It can be shared amongst the atoms. And that is why we said, when now on next to this, again, you attach a heterocyclic ring with more electrons, more lone pairs of electrons are added on onto the anion, and that further stabilizes the anion. As the acidity increases by attachment of electron withdrawing groups to the N1. Remember, the electron withdrawing groups we did mention, when you have the heterocyclic ring and it has a nitrogen, of course, will not withdraw electrons so much. But when you have a nitrogen, you have a nitrogen, you have a sulfur, you have an oxygen. Those are groups with electron withdrawing power. So they withdraw electrons themselves. And once they withdraw electrons, then this nitrogen will be left as deficient of electrons. Once it's deficient of electrons, it will be even more strongly electronegative. It will pull the electrons from the hydrogen, and in so doing, then you will form your anion. But through resonance from the anion charge that is formed, and through resonance of the electrons that are found on the lone pairs of electrons, then this charge is stabilized. And once the charge is stabilized, then you have this anion being stable. You see the stability of this anion. So you can see the negative charge was here initially, now it is here. This can also go in, this can also go in, and that goes out. So the negative charge can also be there. That sharing of that negative charge is what we are calling stabilization by resonance, and that stabilization stabilizes that anion. And as long as the anion is available, then that sulfur will have decreased toxicity. And that is still what we're explaining here. That is still what we're explaining here. So we still have, because this is supposed to be an NH2. No, this is supposed to be the continuation. I don't know why they have opted to put a miscellaneous group. These people also put funny groups. So if you look at this, is our sulfonamide. It has lost. Hello, Ken. So I don't know, as I've said, this miscellaneous group does not make sense. So we are saying you lose that proton there, and this is what we have just mentioned, that this negative can move there, this moves out, this can move here, this moves out, and that is what is responsible for stabilization of an ion. And of course, also we did mention our heterocyclic ring also has groups that are electron donors through resonance, further stabilizing the anion. Sulfonamide group SO2 is unstable and gets stabilized by losing a proton, which results in negative charge being stabilized by resonance with sulfone group. Therefore, the SO2H2 group can be considered as a weak HA acid. HA is HA acid, similar to carboxyl, phenols, and so it's a weak HA acid. So we are considering this to be our hydrogen, and the rest of this, that's the rest of this. So this is our A minus. So we have lost our hydrogen. This is our hydrogen, which was joined here, and the whole of this is A. So HA acid. The R group in the sulfonamide affects the ionizability, the R group which I've mentioned, of NH. If R is electron withdrawing group, the antibacterial activity and solubility of the drug is improved. So if that group withdraws electron. And remember, the withdrawal of electrons is through negative inductive effect, because most of those groups have higher electronegativity. So once they withdraw the electrons, they will be able, as I had said earlier, through negative inductive effects, they will be able to form, the ionization will be more than when you have a group that is not an electron withdrawer. But the other point which they were saying is, if those groups, of course, have the lone pair of electrons, and that I'm still mentioning, the lone pair of electrons is acting independently, because the lone pair of electrons just helps in stabilization. But first of all, you must form the anion. You form the anion, and the anion formed can now be stabilized by the electrons that are present in the heteroatoms. But remember, the heteroatoms first and foremost have in the formation of the anion. The pyrimidine is more electron withdrawing than benzene and thiazole rings. Thiazole substitution produces toxic sulfonamide derivatives. So in other words, the pyrimidine ring, remember, has 2 nitrogens. And as I had said, the order of electronegativity should be oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur has the least. So if you have pyrimidine ring, which has 2 nitrogens, the 2 nitrogens are more powerful in electron withdrawing than a nitrogen and sulfur. And oxygen, isoxazole ring, all oxazole ring, nitrogen and oxygen. And where the oxygen is the one which is directly attached to the sulfonyl group, the oxygen is the most powerful electron withdrawer. So oxygen will be the best in forming the anion. And once it is the best in forming the anion, that resultant sulfonamide will be more ionized. If you have a benzene ring atom that is electron withdrawal, so the sulfur, that's why we are saying the sulfonilamide is the worst in bringing about crystoluria. The lipid solubility influences the pharmacokinetic and bacterial activity, and so increases the half-life and antibacterial activity in vivo. That we have already mentioned. So of importance, we are saying, 1, you have the sulfonamide. The sulfonyl group is unstable in aqueous media. It undergoes ionization, which is enhanced by electron withdrawing group, which are found in the substituent at position number 1. Once that anion is formed, then it is ultimately stabilized by resonance. And once it's stabilized by resonance, it means that the pKa of that resultant, that drug, will behave as a stronger acid when it has a heterocyclic group. Therefore, its pKa is be lower. The lower the pKa, the higher the acidity. So those sulfonamides with low pKa's have much higher stability of their anions than those sulfonamides with high pKa's. So when you synthesize the sulfonamide, you try to synthesize sulfonamides with low pKa's so that they may have high Ka's and therefore will be ionized even in acidic media, which is found in the urine or in the urinary tract. So they will remain in solution in the urinary tract because they have high acidity, and therefore that way we will avoid crystoluria, as I've explained before. Crystoluria and pKa of the sulfonamides. I don't know whether we have existed our time. Indeed we have, but you can see I'm just re-emphasizing what we have discussed, but I think we can end there. So if all this we have already discussed, I'm only de-emphasizing so that we understand how important the groups that are attached to the sulfonamides are. So whatever now we have left to discuss is nothing new. We have discussed basically everything. I'm only further discussing. So the only thing that we have left now is a mode of action, but these other ones, and of course the combination therapy. But what we have actually in these other ones is just further highlighting on those things that we have mentioned. Of course, also the metabolism, which we'll also discuss, but not a lot. And I think we should be able to finish fundaments when we meet next. Is there any question? So can we please sign in if there is any question, raise the question. But I hope you have understood, or you now know the sulfonamides a little better. As I have said, the advantage of what we do is that, of course, when you do the pharmacology, that is, if you have not done it, they will further add further on what we have already done. Designing. If you have any question, please what question. As we have said, we'll have one more lesson next week. We had said if you could afford, you add me one extra one, I'll still push through so that we can summarize everything, because we still have the lymphocytes, they're not much. We'll finish this, and we need just a little bit more time for the lymphocytes, and we'll have finished, so that when you come next semester, you'll not be learning anything more. You just prepare for the exams. Thank you for your patience. Continue praying for me to heal quickly so that I can be more effective.